I call Todd Muller.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak to the Building Earthquake-Prone Buildings and Amendment Bill and echo the sentiment of Mr Twyford. I think this is going to be quite a different debate, but I do want to acknowledge his comment around the passions that everyone brought their own perspectives to in the previous debate. Mr Speaker, perhaps just starting, I was reflecting as Mr Twyford spoke. You know, when everybody in this House will recall where they were on the day of the February earthquake those years ago, and apart from the horror of what we saw, I think deep down we knew that this was going to be something that would stay with us for the rest of our lives, but it would also be an event that would ripple out to impact the whole country over a raft of different areas. As often is the case when you have tragedies of this moment, life changes forever in sometimes not subtle way. And the regulatory response, the policy response to earthquake-prone buildings reflected, I think, the public mood. Initially, there was an understanding. I mean, Mr Twyford used the word clamour, and I think that's fair. There was an expectation of the public that this would never happen again, and we would do everything we could to minimise the risk to people should an earthquake of that severity struck. And of course, invariably, that took the form of an initial bill that was very comprehensive, arguably a one-size-fits-all, that as the Select Committee began to reflect on the submissions from New Zealanders, I think we saw that it was indeed not an appropriate and commensurate response to that age-old question of how do you balance safety to people with the sheer cost of compliance to do that, and what the impact would be to individual families and businesses and communities around the country. And so I think, Mr Speaker, I would echo the sentiment that has been expressed thus far, that I think with this bill, through the very good work of Chairman Scott Simpson, but everybody across the bill, across the committee from all sides, I think have contributed to a bill that is thoughtful, that is considered, and I think lands at the right balance between protecting life and limb and enabling economies and individual families to be able to fund the change and requirements that we have set, or this bill sets. So, as I said, this is all about balance. I'd like, Mr Speaker, to perhaps give an example of a couple of examples of where I think the balance has been landed in the right place. Firstly, Mr Speaker, we included a new section 133AA into clause 23, which looked to exclude certain buildings from the framework of earthquake improvement. Certain residential housing, Mr Speaker, farm buildings, retaining walls that are not integral to the structure, fences, monuments, bridges, wharves and the like. So those are examples where we reflected on the various submissions and decided to pull those out of the obligation. But to counter that, an example of where we tightened it. In section 133AA2, we clarify that hostels and boarding houses that are, and residents of 2 or more stories of specialised accommodation should be included. Because of the nature of what the businesses that are provided in those structures and the increased potential risk to people. As has already been discussed by previous speakers, informed by good data, we were enabled to develop a risk-based approach which split the country into 3, from a high hazard factor, a medium seismic risk factor, and a lower seismic risk. For those listening in Tauranga in the Bay of Plenty, or at least the Western Bay of Plenty where I come from, our area has been landed at the medium-sized seizure risk, and of course, as you would expect, Wellington, Christchurch, Gisborne and Napier are more high. And of course, we now have timeframes to mediate from 15 through to 35 years, depending on the particular time frame. And in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, we have, of course, the priority buildings across the country identified. And if you are a priority building of hospital, or you provide emergency services, or educational facilities are a great example, and you are in those medium or high seismic risks, your time frame to be able to get this all remediated is halved, as it should be, because I think, you know, if you are a priority building as listed, it is important that the investment goes in sooner rather than later to ensure that your risk profile is reduced. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, this is a good bill, and I think reflects the best of our angels when we can collectively, as a House and as a Select Committee, circle around something important and deliver an outcome that's good for New Zealand. Thank you.